Okay, everyone, let's get started. Okay, so we wrapped up last class with a discussion of the weird problem, which is that most studies in psychology are done with samples from weird countries, Western, educated, industrialized, rich democracies. And we're going to start today by talking about the other big problem that the book discusses, a big problem with psychological research, which is the replication crisis. And to really understand how this works, I have to do a bit of methodological background. So in psychology, and actually in closely related sciences like biology, sociology, we have a procedure for determining whether an effect is significant or not, whether an effect is publishable. And that is null hypothesis significance testing, or NHST. Here's the way this procedure works. You put forward a null hypothesis, and the null hypothesis is the hypothesis you want to reject. Or you want to be nullified. It is typically the hypothesis that there is no effect, or there is no correlation. So suppose you're looking at a question in moral psychology. Let's say you're looking for a sex difference in amount of charitable giving. The hypothesis you could have. So here's the population. It's half male, half female, roughly. And let's say your hypothesis is females give more to charity on average. Could be true, just made that up. What you would do is you would get and please try to get on your own time. You would get a sample of, let's say, 100 men and 100 women, and you would ask them how much they give to charity per year. And let's say it probably wouldn't be this big, but let's say that females on average give 9% of their income to charity, and males give on average 4%. It's possible that we got that difference purely due to sampling error. It's possible that in the population, there's no difference. And we got this purely as a result of sampling error. What you calculate in order to do this procedure is a p-value. The p-value is the probability that you would get the result you got if the null hypothesis is true. And remember, in this case, the null hypothesis is there's no difference between males and females in the population, in this case. As I said, I think someone was walking at the time, but the null hypothesis is typically the hypothesis that there is no effect. Now, without using any math, and actually you would need to know more information to calculate it, but intuitively, do we think the p-value would be low or high in this case? Is it unlikely or not that unlikely that we would get a difference this big if there's no difference in the population?
Pretty likely.
Sorry?
Pretty likely, I think.
I would think pretty unlikely, just because it's one is twice as big, right? So in psychology, we almost never have effect sizes that big. Now, as I say, it's not really a fair question because you'd have to know the standard deviation and other information to calculate it, but this difference is large enough that probably the p-value would be low. I mean, you can make it really extreme, right? You can make it like, I don't know, like men give on average, 0.1% or something. Like then, presumably the p-value is going to be very small. Very unlikely you're going to get a difference like that just by chance. So I don't know, maybe the p-value is 0.0001 in a case like that. If the difference was something like this, let's say it was men give 6.1, women give 6.0, so in this case the men come out on top. A difference like that, the p-value is not going to be very small. it's not that unlikely you'd get a difference like that if there's no effect in the population. So maybe the p-value would be, I don't know, 0.6. Again, I'm kind of just making that up. You'd have to know more information. So smaller p-value means less likely you'd get the effect if there's no effect in the population. Get the effect in your sample if there's no effect in the population. And in fields like psychology, we have a cutoff. A cutoff value that we set in advance, and we say, if the p-value falls below this point, we will conclude there is an effect, at least provisionally. Someone tell me what that number is. What's the cutoff? Yeah.
Is that 0.05?
Yep, 0.05. So that's the cutoff that we set. And what that means is we want it to be less than 5% likely that we would get the effect we got if there's no effect in the population. Now, it's kind of arbitrary. There's some debate that maybe some people argue we should set it lower, but that's kind of the convention, is if the effect results in a p-value of less than 0.05, then we will say it's statistically significant. In fact, statistically significant just means the p-value is less. All right, as I said, please try to come on time. Small classrooms, it's a little disruptive. So statistically significant just means the p-value is below our cutoff, which will typically be 0.05. So how does this relate to the replication crisis? Setting this cutoff can create a bad incentive structure. Wherein, because if you do a study and you get 0.07, you will probably not get it published. And what this motivated researchers to do is to take advantage of certain researcher degrees of freedom. There are certain choices that you have to make when doing your study. And there's no rule book for what the right choices are. So just to give some examples, you have to exclude certain people from your sample. And there's no way around this. So for example, in my lab, or with Kyle Nash, the surveys are supposed to take around half an hour to complete. If someone takes, our convention is, if someone takes over 2 hours, or under, I think it's 10 minutes, we exclude them. May vary from study to study if one's a bit longer or whatever. And if someone does it under 10 minutes, obviously they're just randomly clicking, so we exclude them. If they're taking over 2 hours, they're probably leaving the computer. Our manipulation might no longer be having an effect on them, so again, we exclude those people. But as I say, there's no law in the book of science that says thou must make the cutoff 2 hours. It's kind of a matter of choice. And what some people would do is say, well, I don't know, these people who took an hour and a half, they look kind of sketch. I think we're going to exclude them too. And there's a great temptation then to kind of play with the data, and not dishonestly, not faking it, but play with these degrees of freedom until you happen to get a p-value of less than 0.05. Similarly with the number of statistical tests you run. Do you include 2 variables? Do you include a moderator? Which operationalization of the dependent variable do you use? All these things. And the more statistical tests you run, the more likely it is that you will get a significant effect just by chance. Right? If you do enough tests, eventually something's probably going to have a p-value of less than 0.05. Then you're happy and you get it published. That's the result then that you write up in the paper. But you are guaranteeing, at least if many people do this, it's guaranteed that many of these results will be false positives. They will be arrived at just by chance, and therefore not be replicable. So for a long time, statisticians in obscure journals were complaining about these kinds of practices, and there was some early modeling indicating that probably a lot of the results in, actually I think the first time this was argued it was related to medicine, but medicine, psychology, a lot of the results are probably false positives. The statisticians were ignored until in the early 2010s, a group called the Open Science Foundation did a large study in psychology where they took a bunch of random articles from high-profile journals and just tried to replicate it. They looked at what their exclusion criteria were, etc. They pre-registered it, saying this is what we will do. And does anyone remember roughly what the number was? Any of you heard of this? So it depends what you count as a replication, but 30 to 50% of the results replicated, depending on what you set as the cutoff, which you don't have to be a statistician to know that's not good. So this is a very big problem, and now there's a growing movement towards doing things like pre-registration. if any of you go on to do honors, this is a big buzzword now. This means you say in advance, these are the people I'm excluding, these are my hypotheses, this is how I'm testing them. And it's still okay to do exploratory work after. You just have to say, I was originally predicting this, I kind of played with the data and found this, so take that with a grain of salt. And then maybe pre-register that you'll replicate that, the thing that you found, in a more exploratory way. So it kind of binds your hands from pretending that the thing you found through an exploratory means is what you were actually originally predicting. So it's a very important issue, and to talk more about it, I have a video from Brian Earp, who, funny enough, works in moral psychology. One of his papers is in Unit 3, but he explains this. So it's good to hear him say it as well. Okay, so he said something similar to what I said about flexibility and decisions you make when analyzing your data. He also talked about something I didn't mention, which is publication bias. I don't think I have that term in the key terms, but that's just that, like he said, if many people do the same experiment, the only one that's going to get published is the one that happened to find an effect. So that's another thing that makes false positives more likely. As I said, though, there has been improvement in this area. Especially good journals now will often require that experiments be pre-registered, which is a good way of dealing with a lot of these problems. And as I say, if you go on to do an honors thesis, you'll hear a lot about that. That's all I have to say about the replication crisis. Any questions about that? Okay. The next topic, for some reason the computer's not showing, is the relationship between psychology and ethics. And to introduce this, so the book has 3 different options for ways that psychology and ethics could be related. And it leans quite heavily towards one of the 3, and I'm going to lean that way as well. So the bit of background that I have to introduce is the is-ought gap. Have any of you heard of this in a philosophy class or somewhere else? One person, okay. So I'll state it and then I'll try to work our way up to understanding it. You cannot deduce an ought statement from an is statement. Another way of saying that
percent of the time, which suggests that fewer than half of the studies were replicable.
I'm trying to figure out why this isn't working. All right, whatever. Anyway, so another way of saying that, you cannot infer or deduce a moral statement from a descriptive statement. So synonyms here, so is, you could say descriptive or factual. And for ought, you could say moral or normative. The idea that you can't deduce these from these goes back to the philosopher David Hume. I don't think I have him listed, but for whatever it's worth, it goes back to Hume. We'll be seeing a lot of him in the book. So to see why you can't deduce one from the other, I have to explain a bit about deductive logic and how it works. Deductive logic is a process where you draw an inference or deduce something from a set of premises or a set of statements. So you have premises that are reasons in support of a conclusion. So the conclusion is supposed to follow logically from the premises. So this example is used all the time. All men are mortal. This is from Aristotle. 2, Socrates is a man. conclusion, Socrates is mortal. So notice, if the two premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. If someone were to say, I believe in these two, but I don't believe in this, they're just being irrational, right? It just logically follows. So what the is-ought gap says is there's no way to take is statements, descriptive statements, and infer or deduce a moral statement. So I'll give some examples. So let's say you're trying to kind of logically show that it's immoral to punch someone in the face. So you could say premise one, punching someone in the face causes suffering. Premise two, suffering is unpleasant. Conclusion, you, and the different ways of saying it, you ought not to or you should not punch someone in the face. As a matter of deductive logic, the conclusion does not follow. It does not logically follow from the two premises, because there's a term here that doesn't occur in the premises. It comes out of nowhere. And that's really it. That really is the is-ought gap. And you can put anything in here, any descriptive or factual account of the world. There's no way to logically infer that you should not do such and such. What you're missing is a premise that includes a should. So for example, you could, if you add the premise, you should not do things that cause unpleasant outcomes. Okay, now these three premises together imply that you should not punch people in the face, but only with this premise, which of course already has the word should in there. So that's the whole point. With these alone, you can never logically show that you should not do something. This is often used against secular or naturalistic accounts of ethics, but it applies equally well to religious systems of ethics. So if you made, premise one, God commands you to not punch people in the face, that would be a descriptive claim. You're claiming something factually true about the world. And you could say whatever. Premise two, God is all powerful. Conclusion, you should not punch people in the face. Again, there's a missing premise. The missing premise would be something like, you should do what God says, or you should do what an all-powerful being says. Which is fine, there's nothing wrong with having that premise. The point is, though, you just have to have it. You have to explicitly state the premise in order for the conclusion to logically follow. You can't go from descriptive statements alone to a moral or normative conclusion. So that's very important, and really not controversial. We'll see later there's one person we're going to read who tries to jump over the is-ought gap, but it's straightforwardly logically invalid in the way that I've described. Any questions about the is-ought gap? Yeah?
You go just ought, or do you need
Yep.
the is in there?
Yep, you could go ought. Yep, that's fine. And you could go is. That's fine. The point is with deductive logic, the conclusion can't have new things that weren't in the premises. That's just logically invalid. Okay, I will see again if I can make this work. If not, I have to just miss out on the video. Okay, so again, since this is so important, I'm going to show another video of someone briefly explaining the is-ought gap, just to hammer this point home. So in that video, Sam Harris, who's the podcast guest, goes on to argue with Carroll about this. He's one of the few people who has tried to argue that this is a mistake, but almost no one serious agrees with him. It's worth watching, actually. We'll come back to him later in a future reading. So given that, and the book certainly endorses this idea that there is an is-ought gap. However, where does this leave us? Because this is an empirical course, at least mostly. Moral psychology is an empirical discipline. So what do facts have to do with ethics? What do psychological facts in particular have to do with ethics? One view you could take, and some people I think wrongly infer this from the is-ought gap, is that empirical facts about psychology have nothing to do with ethics. That's one option that some people argue for. And I think this is a mistake. While it is true, as I've tried to very emphatically say, that you can't logically infer this from this, empirical facts still can be relevant in conjunction with moral assumptions. So here's a simple example. Suppose you, through psychological investigation, find that a jury's judgment was caused by racial bias. And you can imagine doing empirical work to show that. Now, that by itself doesn't mean the jury made a mistake. You have to also have the assumption that, making judgments caused by racial bias is bad. But if you have that assumption already and you empirically discover through psychological research that a jury made a judgment caused by racism, you can then conclude, this jury made a mistake or did something morally wrong. Now that's a really easy case. There's subtler examples, for example, in chapter 8, but that should illustrate my point that while you can't go from this alone to this, you can make new moral conclusions from empirical results in conjunction with moral assumptions. It's a bit of a wordy sentence, but does that make sense? Any questions about that? I saw some eyes glaze over.
Can you explain the stop as well?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll actually write out the racial bias case. Maybe that'll help. So let's say you use psychological research to show that a jury's decision was caused by racism or racist bias. Now that is an empirical or is or descriptive statement. It's not moral. It's just saying this particular bias caused this judgment. So the is-ought gap would say you can't go straight from this to the jury did something immoral. And that's right, you can't logically deduce that. But you can if you add the assumption that, decisions caused by racism, the ... is just caused by, I feel like writing it all, are immoral. So that's the normative or moral assumption that you have in the background. And these two together can imply this. So on this view, what psychology does is it gives us factual statements that we can then feed into our moral evaluations. Yeah?
Can you just repeat exactly what you just said?
Psychology can feed us empirical facts that we can use in our moral evaluations. They may not have been exactly the sentence I said, but it's the same point. So I think I have this listed in the key terms as the view that empirical facts inform ethics. So some people, the first option is empirical facts are irrelevant to ethics. That's people who I think take the is-ought gap too far and say that empirical facts have nothing to do with ethics. I think that's wrong. The view that empirical facts determine ethics, almost no one holds to that. That just straightforwardly violates the is-ought gap. If you say that empirical facts about psychology alone can determine ethics, that's just a mistake. the, I think, more wise view is the third one, and this is one that the book leans toward, is the view that empirical facts can inform ethics. Okay, one other way, so hopefully this jury example helps. Another way that ethics can be relevant, and I'll tell you right now, this one won't be on the test. This is going to come up in more detail in a later chapter when we talk about free will and moral responsibility. One widely accepted principle in moral philosophy, probably not as widely accepted as this one, but quite widely accepted, is that ought implies can. Meaning, in order for me to, if I say you have a moral duty to do this, you should do this, I'm presupposing that you can do it. If there was someone hanging from the window out there, it would be very strange for me to say, you have a moral duty to fly and save them. That'd be very strange, right? When you say that someone has a moral duty, you're presupposing that they have the ability to do it. Somewhat more controversial than this, but I would say the majority view. If we accept this premise, and this is a normative or moral premise, well then psychology can contribute to this. What sorts of things are we capable of doing? One example the book gives, if it turns out that moral virtues require social support, and that someone can't develop certain virtues without social support, it then becomes strange to say, oh, you should be a more virtuous person if they lack the requisite social support to develop those virtues. So that's another way that descriptive or factual claims can indirectly feed into our ethical reasoning. Okay, last chance for questions on the is-ought gap and related issues. Okay, we have about 10 minutes left, so we're going to close with something that relates to what I talked about last time. And this is a potentially more difficult group activity, so you're all my guinea pigs. I've never taught this class before, but we'll see how we do. So what was the big phrase from last class? It was the title of the video I uploaded.
Reflective equilibrium.
Reflective equilibrium, right? So this is that process I explained where you start off with a set of intuitive judgments, and you posit principles that would justify those judgments. So we have judgments like stealing is wrong, lying is wrong, murder is wrong. So that would be these. So those are like data points from which we will build our moral theory. And then we posit principles like causing suffering is wrong, not doing unto others as you would have them do unto you is wrong, or whatever. And these principles are supposed to explain our judgments. Someone came up and asked me about this, and I thought it was a good point. Can intuitive judgments contradict each other and induce you to change them? And it's a very good point that I forgot to highlight. Our intuitive judgments often disagree with each other. Like not just my judgments with your judgments, but even my own judgments are sometimes contradictory. And that's one reason why it's good to posit principles. They can give you a basis for deciding between conflicting intuitions. So here's the activity. Just to really give you a sense of how this works, in your groups, I want you to try to come up with, go through the process of reflective equilibrium. Come up with a small number of moral principles maybe 2 to 4, that can explain as many intuitive judgments as possible. And try to play devil's advocate. So maybe like one of you will say, well, here's a good principle. So the example I gave last time was, don't cause suffering. And maybe another person tried to play devil's advocate. Well, what about this case? What about a case where you're performing surgery on someone, or some other thing where causing suffering is actually good? Oh, okay, and then modify the principle, right? If a judgment contradicts the principle, maybe modify it so it can include this judgment. And if you want to play devil's advocate for the principle, you could say back, no, actually in this case, this principle explains enough of our judgments that we're going to go the other way. We're actually going to just say, that judgment we're going to let go of. So, see how far we have 8 minutes left. So just try this out to get a sense of how reflective equilibrium works. Try to come up with 2 to 4-ish principles that explain as many judgments as possible. Have fun with your groups. We'll see what we come up with. Does any group want to volunteer one of their principles? What are ones that got the most consensus? Different candidate principles. Yep.
We started with violence is wrong,
Mm-hmm.
and then we talked about the case of either violence in self-defense or violence to protect somebody else being attacked, or consensual violence like wrestling we came
Yep.
up with. So then we modified it to be unprovoked violence.
Great example, yeah. So you posit a principle, cause violence is wrong, explain some judgments, but what about self-defense? What about wrestling? Okay, modify it to be unprovoked or unconsensual violence. Great example. Any other examples? Yep.
We started with don't cause suffering,
Right.
and then we added
Well, that's a great one.
treat others how you want to be treated.
Yep. So those two are good.
And then we had the case of like, if you have to choose between yourself or another person, is it okay to act in your own interest? So we added another principle that you can act in your own interest first.
If there's like a conflict between two equally valid things. Yeah, good. So hopefully this helped you see how this would work in practice. I'll be nice and tell you right now, I already basically did, one of the written questions will be about this. So make sure you understand reflective equilibrium. Because Valerie Tiberius, the textbook author, is going to appeal to it again and again. So that's all I have to say about chapter 1. So next time we'll start chapter 2, which is on the question of whether moral inclinations are innate. So I will see you all next class for that.